The dry, abrasive wind of the southern Mesopotamian desert carries with it a fine particulate of silt, the pulverized remains of a world that existed long before the first foundations of Ur or Uruk were ever laid. To stand upon the Tell of Abu Sharain, the site of ancient Eridu, is to press one's boots into a stratigraphic record that defies the standard brevity of human civilization. Beneath the sun-baked crust of the modern surface lies a sequence of cultural deposits extending downward into the dark, damp layers of the early Holocene, and further still, into a chronological abyss that modern archaeology struggles to reconcile with the physical evidence left behind in the clay. In the early 20th century, the recovery of a four-sided baked clay prism, now known as the Weld-Blundell prism, forced a confrontation between the linear progress of historical thought and a record of time so expansive it borders on the geological. This artifact, inscribed in precise cuneiform, does not speak of centuries or decades, but of tens of thousands of years, recording a succession of rulers whose tenures on the throne of Eridu and its sister cities span durations that would encompass the entirety of recorded modern history several times over. The prism itself feels deceptively heavy for its size, approximately 20 centimeters in height, its surface is crowded with the angular, rhythmic indentations of a scribe who lived nearly 4,000 years ago. Yet, the information it carries is a transcription of an even older oral or written tradition, one that looks back through the terminal Pleistocene to a period when the very geography of the Near East was unrecognizable. The text begins with a statement of cold, administrative clarity. After the kingship lowered from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. There is no preamble, no poetic flourish, only the recording of a transfer of authority. Alulaim, the first named sovereign, is recorded as having ruled for 28,800 years. To the modern mind, trained in the biological limits of the sapiens phenotype, such a number is dismissed as mythological inflation or a symbolic representation of prestige. However, when one examines the environmental context of the Persian Gulf basin during the last glacial maximum, a different possibility emerges. At that time, the Gulf was not a sea but a fertile, low-lying terrestrial plain, fed by the combined waters of the Tigris, Euphrates, and Karun rivers. This was a world of stable, high-yield ecosystems that existed for millennia before the rising tides of the post-glacial meltwater pulses submerged it. The Sumerian King List may not be a collection of fables, but a surviving fragment of the administrative archives of a precursor civilization that occupied this lost Eden, a group whose biological markers and technical capabilities were forged in a previous epoch of Earth's history. The second king, Alalngar, is listed as ruling for 36,000 years. Following him, the kingship moved to Bad Tibera, where Enmenluana presided for 43,200 years. These durations are not random. They possess a rhythmic, almost mathematical consistency. If one looks at the total duration of the 8 kings who ruled before the Great Deluge, the sum is 241,200 years. This spans a period that aligns with the late Middle Pleistocene through the Upper Paleolithic, a vast stretch of time during which standard anthropology suggests humans were little more than nomadic hunter-gatherers utilizing lithic tools. Yet, the King List describes a highly structured urban hierarchy, specialized labor, and the lowering of a systematic governing structure. The engineering required to maintain a city for 40,000 years suggests a mastery over the environment that goes beyond simple irrigation. It implies a society that had solved the problems of urban decay, resource depletion, and perhaps even the biological mechanism of senescence itself. The stones of Eridu, if they could be traced back to their primary foundations, might reveal a masonry not of sun-dried mud brick, but of a high-density vitrified material capable of resisting the slow, grinding erosion of the desert's salt-laden air for dozens of millennia. As we move through the stratigraphic layers of the Sumerian heartland, the transition from these antediluvian giants to the post-flood rulers is marked by a sharp, violent discontinuity. The silt layers found in the excavation of Shuruppak and Kish provide a tactile boundary, a thick, sterile deposit of waterborne clay that contains no artifacts, no bones, and no organic debris. It is a geological scar representing a catastrophic hydrological event of global proportions. The King List records this event with chilling brevity. Then the flood swept over. This was not a local riverine inundation, but the result of a rapid, global sea level rise, likely triggered by the collapse of the Laurentide ice sheet or a sudden thermal event at the end of the Younger Dryas. When the kingship lowered from heaven for the second time, it was in the city of Kish, but the reigns of the kings had dramatically shortened. They dropped from 30,000 years to 1,200, then to 900, and eventually to the standard human lifespan we recognize today. This decay curve suggests a fundamental shift in the terrestrial environment or the biological integrity of the ruling class. If the first kings were indeed survivors of a primary civilization that had mastered advanced longevity through anomalous engineering or genetic stabilization, the post-flood world, characterized by erratic climate shifts, increased solar radiation, and a fragmented resource base, would have seen their biological advantage slowly erode. The weight of the sediment above these ancient ruins is immense, pressing down on the secrets of a time when the stars in the night sky were in different positions due to the slow wobble of the Earth's axis. The Sumerians were obsessed with the movements of the heavens, not as a matter of religious devotion, but as a survival mechanism. Their king list functions as a chronological anchor, tethering their late Bronze Age reality to a deep time heritage they were desperate not to forget. In the cold, quiet halls of the museums where these tablets now reside, the ambient hum of modern electricity feels ephemeral and fragile. We are looking at a record of a civilization that endured for 250,000 years, whereas our own global industrial society has yet to survive 3 centuries. The sheer scale of the antediluvian reigns challenges our perception of human potential. It suggests that the first civilization did not merely build temples, but managed the very equilibrium of the planet, presiding over an era of stability that ended when the Earth's geological processes reasserted themselves with a violence that scrubbed the surface clean of all but the most durable records. Walking through the excavated remains of the Iabzu Temple in Eridu, the air is heavy with the smell of dry earth and old stone. The foundations here are built one on top of the other, 18 successive levels of architecture reaching back into the Ubaid period. But even at the lowest level, the engineering is already sophisticated. The builders knew how to calculate the load-bearing capacity of the marshy soil, how to orient their structures to the cardinal points, and how to manage the flow of the subterranean aquifers they called the Abzu. This knowledge did not evolve in a vacuum. It was inherited. The gods the Sumerians described, the Anunnaki, were likely the physical representatives of this precursor era, individuals whose lifespans were so vastly different from the emerging Neolithic populations that they were perceived as eternal. They were the architects of the pre-flood cities, the keepers of the Mi, which the texts describe as a collection of physical objects or datasets containing the blueprints for civilization. Everything from the art of writing and metallurgy to the rituals of kingship and the laws of the physical world. The transition from the Pleistocene to the Holocene was a period of profound environmental trauma. As the glaciers retreated and the sea levels rose, the low-lying plains of the Persian Gulf were inundated, forcing the survivors of the first civilization into the higher ground of the Mesopotamian alluvium. Here, they attempted to restart the machinery of urban life, but the conditions had changed. The atmospheric pressure, the nutrient density of the soil, and perhaps even the magnetic field of the planet had shifted, no longer supporting the extreme longevity of the previous epoch. The king list meticulously tracks this decline. The kings of Kish, such as Jushur and Kulisinabel, ruled for durations in the hundreds of years, a significant reduction from the tens of thousands of their predecessors, but still anomalous by modern standards. This represents the twilight of the giants, a period of biological degradation where the remnants of the pre-cataclysmic elite were slowly being subsumed by the burgeoning population of modern humans. To understand the Sumerian King List, one must look at it through the lens of a forensic investigator rather than a mythologist. When a scribe records that Enmen-Galana ruled for 28,800 years, we must ask what kind of biological or technological framework would allow for such a span. In the modern era, we are beginning to identify the genetic markers of aging and the potential for life extension through cellular repair. It is plausible that an earlier iteration of advanced society reached the pinnacle of this science, creating a ruling caste that was effectively biological constant. Their rule was not measured in generations, but in geological substages. They would have witnessed the slow migration of forests, the gradual shifting of river courses, and the rise and fall of entire subspecies of fauna. Their perspective on time would have been radically different from ours, focused on the preservation of a deep time stability that we can scarcely imagine. The ruins of Bad Tibera, the Wall of the Metalworkers, sit as a silent reminder of this lost industrial heritage. The texts associate this city with the 3rd, 4th, and 5th kings of the antediluvian era. The name itself suggests a center of advanced metallurgy, perhaps a facility where the anomalous engineering of the precursor civilization was practiced. If we could penetrate the deepest layers of this site, beyond the reach of conventional archaeology, we might find evidence of alloys that do not belong in the Bronze Age, metals processed with a precision that requires controlled vacuum environments or high-energy plasma fields. The Sumerians spoke of the heavenly origin of their kingship, a term that in a grounded context could refer to an orbital or high-altitude origin for the technology that sustained their society. The descent of kingship was the re-establishment of this technological order on the terrestrial surface after a period of orbital refuge or high-altitude isolation during the worst of the planetary upheavals. The silence of the desert is absolute, broken only by the occasional rattle of a sun-bleached thorn bush. In this stillness, the numbers on the King List take on a haunting quality. 241,200 years of history that we have simply ignored because it does not fit into the narrow window of our established narrative. We treat the Sumerians as the beginning of the story, but they saw themselves as the survivors of a much older, much longer story. They were the inheritors of a dying world, clutching at the fragments of a 200,000-year-old administrative tradition. The King List is their ledger of what was lost. It is a document of mourning as much as it is a record of governance. Every name and every long-form date is a defiant scream against the onset of the short time that characterizes our current age. As the sun sets over the ruins of Larsa, the shadows of the crumbling mud-brick ziggurats stretch across the sand, pointing toward a past that is increasingly difficult to reach. The stratigraphic layers continue to hold their secrets, buried under millions of tons of river silt and desert dust. But the Weld-Blundell prism remains, a physical object that forces us to reckon with the possibility that we are not the first masters of this planet. We are merely the latest occupants of a world that has seen civilizations rise, endure for hundreds of millennia, and then vanish into the geological record, leaving behind only a few lines of cuneiform to tell us who they were and how long they stayed. The kings of Eridu were not gods, but they were not quite men either. They were the guardians of a deep-time stability that we are only now beginning to realize we have lost. The air grows colder as the desert floor releases its heat, a reminder of the thermal cycles that have governed the Earth's history for millions of years. The Sumerian kings lived through these cycles, their long reigns spanning glacial advances and interglacial retreats. They saw the world change in ways that we only understand through the study of ice cores and seabed sediments. To them, the flood was not just a story, but the final collapse of a 241,000-year-old status quo. When the waters receded, the world was colder, darker, and more hostile. The long-lived rulers found themselves out of sync with the new environment. Their biology began to fail, their memory began to fade, and so they wrote it down, every king, every city, every year, so that those of us who came after, living our short, flickering lives, would know that once the kingship lasted as long as the stars. The investigate of the Sumerian King List requires us to move beyond the comfort of the standard archaeological timeline. We must be willing to look at the out-of-Africa migration and the development of the human brain not as a slow, linear crawl, but as a process that may have been punctuated by the presence of a superior, long-lived precursor. If a group of individuals can live for 30,000 years, their capacity for the accumulation of knowledge, the refinement of technology, and the manipulation of the social fabric is absolute. They would be the ultimate engineers of the soul, shaping the development of the younger, shorter-lived species in their image. The Sumerian culture, with its sudden appearance of complex mathematics, astronomy, and law, looks less like an indigenous development and more like a legacy kit handed down by these departing giants. The grit of the sand underfoot is a reminder of the physical reality of the Mesopotamian basin. This is not a landscape of dreams, but a landscape of sediment. Every centimeter of dust represents decades of time. To reach the levels of the first kings, one would have to dig through meters of Holocene silt, through the terminal Pleistocene boundary, and deep into the layers of the last ice age. There, buried in the anaerobic mud of the submerged Persian Gulf, lie the remains of the cities mentioned in the list: Eridu, Bad Tibera, Larak, Sippar, and Shurapak. These were not mere villages, but the nodes of a global network, connected by trade and technology that we are only now beginning to rediscover. The King List is our map to this buried world, a world where time was measured in tens of thousands of years, and the rule of law was as constant as the movement of the planets. As we continue to peel back the layers of the forgotten Earth, we find that the further back we look, the more sophisticated the evidence becomes. The megalithic foundations of Baalbek, the precision-cut stones of the Giza Plateau, and the impossible chronologies of the Sumerians all point to the same conclusion. There was a first civilization of immense duration and technical capability. They were the authors of the King List, the builders of the first cities, and the survivors of the Great Catastrophe. We are their descendants, living in the ruins of their world, struggling to understand the numbers they left behind. But the numbers do not lie. They are a record of a time when the earth was different, and the kings lived as long as the mountains. The investigation does not end with the translation of a clay prism. It begins there. It leads us into the depths of the earth, into the study of genetics, and into the observation of the stars. It forces us to ask what it means to be human in a universe that operates on timescales we can barely comprehend. The Sumerian kings were a bridge between the deep time of the earth and the short time of human history. Their names, Alulim, Alanger, and Menluana, are the echoes of a world that was lost when the floods swept over, a world that we are only just beginning to remember. The weight of that memory is as heavy as the stone of a ziggurat, and as enduring as the silt of the Tigris. The stratigraphic discontinuity at the end of the pre-flood period is perhaps the most significant physical evidence we possess. In every major Sumerian city, archaeologists have found a layer of clean, water-deposited clay. In Shurapak, this layer is nearly 5 feet thick. Above it, the tools are different, the pottery is different, and the lifespans of the kings begin their rapid descent. Below it, we find the remnants of a world that had remained stable for hundreds of thousands of years. This is the 0 point of our history. Everything before it is relegated to the realm of myth, but for the Sumerians, it was as real as the ground beneath their feet. They lived in the shadow of the giants, and their king list was their way of keeping the shadow alive. The scent of the desert air at night is clean and sharp, carrying the faint odor of mineral salts and ancient dust. It is a reminder that the earth is a graveyard of civilizations, most of which have left no trace at all. We are fortunate that the Sumerians were so meticulous that they valued the record of their ancestors enough to bake it into clay. The Weld-Blundell prism is a message across time, a warning that the stability of our world is an illusion, and that we are merely one chapter in a much longer, much more complex story. The 241,200 years of the pre-flood kings are not a mistake. They are a window into the true nature of our past, a past that is etched in stone and clay, waiting for us to find the courage to believe what it tells us. The slow burn of historical discovery is often found in the details that don't fit, the outliers, the anomalies. The Sumerian King List is the ultimate outlier. It sits at the very base of our historical records, challenging everything we think we know about the timeline of human development. If we accept the post-flood kings as historical, which most scholars do, then on what basis do we reject the pre-flood kings? Simply because their reigns are too long. That is a biological bias, not a scientific one. If the evidence of the flood layer is real, and the cities themselves are real, then we must consider the possibility that the kings were real as well. And if they were real, then the history of our species is hundreds of thousands of years longer than we have been told. The sun begins to rise, casting a long, low light over the mounds of Eridu. The golden hour illuminates the textures of the mud bricks, revealing the straw and the grit that holds them together. These are the same materials the Sumerians used to rebuild their world after the catastrophe. But deep beneath them, the foundations of the first Eridu are made of something else, something older and more durable. We may never see those foundations, but we can feel their presence in the weight of the history they support. The King List is the key to that history, a sequence of names and numbers that stretch back into the darkness of the Pleistocene, reminding us that we are the children of a very old, very sophisticated, and very forgotten Earth. The process of biological senescence, the gradual wearing out of the body's cellular machinery, is often viewed as an inevitable law of nature. However, in the context of the Sumerian King List, we are forced to reconsider this assumption. If the first 8 kings ruled for a combined 241,200 years, their average reign was roughly 30,000 years. This implies a biological state where the oxidative stress and genetic degradation that limit modern human lifespans were either absent or actively suppressed. In the environment of the pre-cataclysmic Earth, perhaps the protective magnetosphere was stronger, or the atmospheric composition provided a more stable internal chemistry. Or, more likely, these individuals were the beneficiaries of a highly advanced form of anomalous engineering, a genetic or cybernetic stabilization that allowed for a near-indefinite preservation of consciousness and physical form. The Sumerians called them kings, but they may have been something closer to biological custodians, individuals tasked with the long-term management of the planet's systems. The city of Sippar, according to the King List, was the 4th city to receive the kingship before the flood. Its king, Enmendarana, ruled for 21,000 years. Sippar was the city of Shamash, the sun god, but in a grounded documentary context, Shamash represents the principles of justice, light, and, crucially, navigation. The tablets of destiny were said to be kept here, which were likely not mystical objects but sophisticated data storage devices containing the astronomical and mathematical constants required to maintain a global civilization. A ruler who lives for 20,000 years would have a personal, first-hand understanding of the precession of the equinoxes, a cycle that takes 25,920 years to complete. To such a being, the movement of the stars would be as familiar as the changing of the seasons is to us. They would not need to theorize about deep-time cycles. They would have lived through them. The sedimentary records of the Persian Gulf floor reveal a series of rapid transgressions and regressions, sea level changes that occurred with startling speed. One such event, known as Meltwater Pulse 1A, saw sea levels rise by as much as 20 meters in less than 500 years. For a civilization built on the fertile plains of the Gulf Basin, this would have been a catastrophe beyond measure. The cities of the King List, Eridu, Bad Tibera, Larak, would have been slowly but inexorably swallowed by the rising tide. The flood was not a single afternoon of rain, but a multi-generational struggle against an encroaching ocean, culminating in a final, violent surge that broke the last of the natural barriers and scoured the Mesopotamian plain. The survivors who fled to the higher ground of the northern alluvium brought with them the only thing they could: their records. The Weld-Blundell prism is the distilled essence of those records, a desperate attempt to maintain a link to a 200,000-year-old lineage that had been physically erased by the water. In the silence of the excavation trenches, one can almost hear the rhythmic striking of the scribe's stylus against the wet clay. Each wedge-shaped mark is a data point, a piece of a larger puzzle that we are only now beginning to assemble. The transition from the king Enmenluana to Enmengalana is not just a change of names, but a transition of millennia. Imagine the continuity of policy, the depth of institutional memory, and the slow, deliberate pace of cultural evolution in a society where the leader does not change for 40,000 years. There would be no frantic rush for progress, no short-term exploitation of resources. The civilization would operate on a scale of profound stability, its goals measured in centuries and its legacy measured in epochs. This is the world the King List describes, a world that is utterly alien to our own, yet one that forms the very foundation of our existence. The chemical signature of the flood layer in the Mesopotamian soil is distinct. It is a mixture of fine-grained clay and microscopic marine organisms, indicating that the water that covered the land was not merely river overflow, but a massive incursion from the sea. This matches the geological evidence of the post-glacial period, where the sudden release of glacial lakes in North America or the collapse of ice shelves in Antarctica caused global tsunami events. For the people living in the first civilization, this was the end of the world. The King List records the names of the survivors who attempted to rebuild. But as we see in the years that followed, the spark was dying. The post-flood kings of Kish ruled for 1,200 years, then 900, then 600. The anomalous longevity was failing. Whether this was due to the loss of the technological infrastructure required to maintain their biology, or a fundamental change in the Earth's environment that made such long lives impossible, the result was the same. the giants were fading away. The weight of the atmosphere, the intensity of the sun's radiation, and even the isotopic composition of the water we drink are all factors that influence the rate of biological aging. In the time of the first kings, the Earth may have been a more protected environment. Some researchers suggest the presence of a vapor canopy or a more robust ozone layer that filtered out the DNA-damaging ultraviolet rays that now contribute to our senescence. Without this protection, the pre-flood rulers found themselves exposed to a harsh new reality. Their bodies, though still far more resilient than ours, began to succumb to the cumulative damage of the environment. The King List is a biological record of this decline, a decay curve that shows the slow transition from the 30,000-year reigns of the antediluvians to the 120-year lifespan of a modern human. The city of Larak, the third city to hold the kingship, is often overlooked. Its king, Ensephezadana, ruled for 28,800 years. Larak is thought to have been located near the modern site of Tel al-Walaya, but the deepest levels of this mound remain unexplored. What would we find if we reached the Pleistocene strata of Larak? Perhaps we would find the remains of the anomalous engineering mentioned in the texts, the machines and materials that allowed a city to function for 30,000 years. We might find evidence of energy production that left no carbon footprint, or transport systems that did not rely on the wheel. The Sumerians spoke of the chariots of the gods, which in a grounded context would be the specialized vehicles used by the long-lived elite to traverse their global domain. These were not magical objects, but the standard tools of a civilization that had moved far beyond our current level of technological development. The scribe who wrote the Weld-Blundell Prism was not an author, but a curator. He was working in a tradition that viewed history not as a series of random events, but as a structured, intentional process. The King List was the framework for that process. It provided a sense of order in a world that had become chaotic and unpredictable. By recording the names of the ancient kings, the Sumerians were asserting their right to exist, their right to the land, and their connection to the first civilization. They were saying, "We are not new. We are the survivors. We are the heirs to 241,200 years of authority." This sense of deep-time heritage is what gave Sumerian culture its unique strength and its profound influence on all the civilizations that followed. The texture of the clay is the most important part of the Weld-Blundell Prism. It is the physical medium that has preserved this impossible information for 4 millennia. Clay is the sediment of the rivers, the very substance of the Mesopotamian land. By writing their history on clay, the Sumerians were literally grounding their story in the earth. They knew that stone can crumble and wood can rot, but baked clay is nearly indestructible. It is the perfect medium for a deep-time record. When we hold a tablet like the King List, we are touching the same material that the first kings would have used to record their own laws and their own observations of the world. It is a direct, tactile link to the first civilization, a bridge across the flood and across the millennia. The transition from the reign of Dumuzi, the shepherd, who ruled for 36,000 years, to the reign of Enmendarana in Sippar, marks a shift in the nature of the kingship. The titles become more specific, reflecting the specialized roles that the long-lived rulers played in the management of their society. The shepherd was not a literal herder of sheep, but a guardian of the biological population, a ruler tasked with the preservation of the human stock during a period of environmental instability. This kind of biological management is a hallmark of an advanced civilization, one that views its citizens not as subjects, but as a precious resource to be protected and nurtured over the course of centuries. The shadows in the desert are long and deep, hiding the secrets of the mounds that have yet to be excavated. We have only scratched the surface of the Mesopotamian plain. Thousands of tells remain untouched, each one potentially containing fragments of the pre-flood world. The Sumerian King List is our guide, telling us where to look and what to expect. It tells us that the history of the earth is not a short, simple story of progress, but a long, complex cycle of rise and fall, of mastery and catastrophe. The 241,200 years of the first kings are not a myth to be dismissed, but a challenge to be met. They are a call to look deeper into the stratigraphic layers, to question our assumptions about the limits of human potential, and to remember the world that existed before the flood swept over. The investigation of the King List is a slow burn because it requires us to change the way we think about time. We are used to thinking in decades and centuries, but the King List forces us to think in millennia and epochs. It forces us to confront the reality of deep time, the vast stretches of history that have been erased by the Earth's geological processes. The Sumerians were the first to record this reality, and they did so with a precision and a clarity that should command our respect. Their kings were not the products of a fevered imagination, but the documented rulers of a civilization that lasted longer than we can currently imagine. They were the masters of the forgotten earth, and their names are the only thing that remains of a world that was once ours as well. Continuing the narrative, the script moves into the scientific implications of the post-flood biological decline. The abruptness of the change is documented in the King List with a numerical precision that mirrors a radioactive decay curve. In the first city after the flood, Kish, the reigns average between 400 and 1,200 years. By the time we reach the first dynasty of Uruk and the famous reign of Gilgamesh, the numbers have settled into the 120-year range, a figure that matches the modern biological limit for human longevity, the Hayflick limit of cellular division. This suggests that the first civilization survivors were not just losing their technology, but were undergoing a fundamental physiological shift. The atmospheric pressure of the post-flood world, perhaps lower than that of the Pleistocene, could no longer support the hyperoxygenation required for such extreme lifespans. The survivors were becoming short-lived, their once vast memories and deep time perspectives shrinking to fit the new, accelerated pace of a dying world. The ziggurats of Sumer, with their massive, layered platforms, were not just temples but symbolic representations of this lost stratigraphic history. Each level was a stage of time, a step back toward the first kingship that had lowered from heaven. When a Sumerian priest stood at the top of a ziggurat, he was not just looking at the stars. He was attempting to reconnect with the high-altitude or orbital perspective of his ancestors. He was looking for the return of the me, the datasets of the primary civilization. The King List was the administrative backbone of this spiritual quest, a proof of lineage that justified the continued existence of the priesthood and the state. It was a document of continuity in a world of radical change, a way of saying that despite the flood, despite the shortening of lives, the original order still held. The scent of bitumen, the thick, black tar used by the Sumerians to waterproof their boats and bind their bricks, is a recurring sensory theme in the archaeology of the region. This substance, a natural byproduct of the vast oil reserves beneath the Mesopotamian basin, was the blood of their industrial efforts. It was used in the construction of the massive quay walls and the reinforcement of the canal systems that kept the desert at bay. But the use of bitumen also points to a sophisticated understanding of chemical engineering. If the Sumerians were using it to preserve their mud brick structures for centuries, what were their ancestors using to preserve their cities for tens of thousands of years? Perhaps the anomalous engineering of the pre-flood kings involved the use of advanced polymers or synthetic composites, materials that have long since degraded into the generic organic compounds found in the deep oil shales of the region. The further we dig, the more the King List begins to look like a surviving fragment of a much larger, global administrative record. Similar chronologies are found in the Egyptian Manethos records, which speak of the reign of the gods lasting for 30,000 years, followed by the reign of the demigods for another 15,000. These are not coincidences. They are the fragmented echoes of a global first age, a period when the entire planet was under the management of a long-lived, technologically advanced elite. The Sumerian King List is simply the most intact and most mathematically consistent of these records. It provides the specific names, the specific cities, and the specific durations that allow us to anchor this first age in a grounded historical context. It is a ledger of the time when the Earth was a managed system, before the sweep of the flood returned it to its natural chaotic state. The silence of the Well-Blundell Prism is the silence of a tomb. It is a monument to a world that died 12,000 years ago, and to a lineage of kings who ruled for longer than we have been civilized. But in that silence, there is also a message of hope. If humans, or a precursor species closely related to us, once lived for 30,000 years and built a global civilization that lasted for 250,000, then our current limitations are not absolute. They are the result of an environmental and historical accident, a short time that we can eventually overcome. The Sumerian King List is not just a record of the past. It is a blueprint for the future, a reminder of the true potential of our species when we learn to live in harmony with the deep time cycles of the earth. As the wind continues to scour the mounds of Abu Sharain, the grit and the silt continue to accumulate, burying the ziggurats and the temples under the weight of the years. But the King List remains, a testament to the power of memory and the durability of clay. It tells us that history is not a line, but a circle, a series of rises and falls, of beginnings and endings. The kings of Eridu were the masters of the last circle, and we are the masters of this one. Whether we will leave behind a record as enduring and as challenging as theirs remains to be seen. But as long as the well-blundell prism exists, we will know that once, the kingship lasted as long as the stars, and the world was ruled by those who lived through the deep time of the earth. The abrasive grit of the Mesopotamian wind serves as a constant, grinding reminder of the subtractive nature of time. At the archaeological site of Tel El-Madain, believed to be the location of ancient Bad Tibra, the second city of the antediluvian kings, the landscape is a desolate expanse of salt-crusted dunes and shattered pottery. According to the King List, this was the seat of power for Enmen-Luana, Enmen-Galana, and Dumuzid the Shepherd, whose combined reigns covered in staggering 108,000 years. To walk this ground is to stand atop a vertical cemetery of civilizations, where the weight of the overburdened millions of tons of accumulated dust and debris compresses the lower strata into a dense, rock-like substance. In these deepest reaches, the chemistry of the soil changes. The standard organic signatures of human habitation begin to fade, replaced by anomalous trace elements, isotopes of refined metals and vitrified silicates that do not occur in the simple firing of a pottery kiln. This suggests that the Wall of the Metalworkers was more than a poetic name. It was a description of a high-energy industrial hub that operated on a scale of duration that makes the entire Bronze Age appear as a mere flicker. The engineering of Bad Tibra remains hidden beneath the cumulative weight of the Holocene, yet the textual record provides clues to its function. The kingship that was exercised here was intimately tied to the Me, the sets of divine decrees or technological blueprints that governed every aspect of existence. In a grounded historical context, these Me represent the standardized technical protocols of the precursor civilization, datasets for hydraulic management, biological preservation, and metallurgical precision. For a king to rule for 30,000 years, the infrastructure of his city must be equally durable. This implies a mastery of material science that utilized non-corrosive alloys and self-repairing masonry. The Sumerian obsession with foreverness in their building projects was not a religious aspiration but a cultural memory of a time when cities actually survived for geological epochs. They were attempting to replicate, with mud and bitumen, the indestructible foundations of the antediluvian world. The biological reality of the three kings of Bad Tibra requires a radical reassessment of the human condition during the Pleistocene. If we look at the environmental data recovered from ice cores in Greenland and Vostok, we see a planet that was fundamentally different from the one we inhabit today. The atmospheric pressure may have been higher, and the terrestrial magnetic field more intense, providing a robust shield against the cosmic radiation that accelerates cellular aging. Within this protected environment, the first civilization could have developed a stable, long-lived phenotype. The kings were not gods in the supernatural sense, but biological constants, individuals whose cellular repair mechanisms were perfectly tuned to their environment. Their long reigns allowed for the accumulation of experience and wisdom that is impossible in our current short-lived state. They were the architects of a global stability, managing the Earth's resources with the perspective of beings who knew they would still be alive to see the consequences of their decisions 10,000 years in the future. The transition to the third city, Larik, and its king Ensephezadana, who ruled for 28,800 years, brings us to the site of Tel El-Walaya. Here, the stratigraphic record is a chaotic jumble of riverine deposits and wind-blown silt. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers have shifted their courses countless times over the millennia, erasing the physical context of the ancient cities. However, the King List persists as a stable reference point, a lithic record that survives when the cities themselves are lost. The name Ensipatzadana translates to the true shepherd of the heavens, a title that links the ruler to the observation and perhaps the management of orbital bodies. During his 28,000-year reign, the stars would have completed more than a full precessional cycle. The North Star would have shifted from Thuban to Vega and back again. For such a ruler, the heavens were not a distant, mysterious realm, but a dynamic and predictable system that was integral to the governance of the earth. The fifth and final pre-flood city was Shuruppak, where the kingship was held by Ubra-Tutu for 18,600 years. Shuruppak is one of the few antediluvian cities that has been extensively excavated at its later levels. Archaeologists like Robert Coldway and Eric Schmidt found a city of immense wealth and organization, but it was the discovery of the sterile layer that truly defined the site. This layer of yellow, sandy clay, nearly 2 meters thick, contains no artifacts and no signs of life. It sits like a cold, heavy blanket over the ruins of the earlier settlement. This is the physical manifestation of the flood that swept over. It is a geological event captured in the soil, a sudden and violent interruption of a history that had been continuous for nearly 250,000 years. Below this layer, the evidence of human activity is sparse but sophisticated, consisting of obsidian tools and finely worked stone that suggest a level of craft far beyond the capabilities of the later post-flood inhabitants. The sweep of the flood was the terminal event for the first civilization. In the King List, this catastrophe is treated as a chronological boundary, a 0 point that separates the age of the long-lived masters from the age of the short-lived survivors. The physical cause of the flood remains a subject of intense geological investigation. Some evidence points to a sudden, catastrophic melting of the polar ice caps, perhaps triggered by a thermal event or a glancing impact from a bolide. This would have caused a rapid rise in sea levels, inundating the low-lying plains of the Persian Gulf and the Mesopotamian basin. For a civilization built on these fertile plains, the result would have been total destruction. The kingship had to be lowered from heaven a second time, this time in the city of Kish, but the world it returned to was fundamentally altered. The kings of the first dynasty of Kish represent the beginning of the decay curve. Jushur, the first post-flood king, ruled for 1,200 years, a massive reduction from the 18,600 years of Ubra-Tutu. This reduction is not random. It follows a pattern seen in biological systems under extreme stress. The post-flood environment was likely characterized by increased solar radiation, a thinner atmosphere, and a fragmented resource base. The anomalous engineering that had supported the extreme longevity of the antediluvian kings was either lost or no longer functional in the New World. The survivors were forced to adapt to a short-lived existence, their biological systems degrading with each passing generation. The King List records this tragedy with administrative coldness, tracking the shortening of reigns as the memory of the first civilization began to fade into myth. To study the King List is to confront the fragility of our own civilization. We are currently living in a period of relative climatic stability that has lasted for about 10,000 years, a mere fraction of the 241,000-year duration of the pre-flood era. The Sumerians, living in the ruins of a world that had endured for hundreds of millennia, would have viewed our modern progress as ephemeral and reckless. Their focus was on the preservation of the me, the essential knowledge required to maintain the stability of the human species in a hostile environment. They understood that the Earth is a place of periodic catastrophe, and that the only thing that survives the sweep of the flood is the record of what came before. The Weld-Blundell prism is that record, a desperate attempt to transmit the deep-time heritage of the first civilization across the abyss of the Holocene. The site of Kish, where the kingship first returned after the flood, is a sprawling complex of mounds located near the modern city of Hilla. Excavations here have revealed a sequence of monumental buildings that demonstrate the Sumerians' determination to rebuild the grandeur of the Old World. The ziggurats of Kish were among the largest in Mesopotamia, built with a precision that suggests an inheritance of advanced architectural principles. But the reigns of the kings of Kish continued to shorten. Kulasinabel ruled for 960 years, Nanjishlishma for 670, and Enmebar-Jizi for 900. These are still durations that exceed the modern human lifespan, but they represent the final, flickering embers of the old biological order. By the time we reach the end of the Kish dynasty and the rise of Uruk, the transition to the modern human timescale is almost complete. The ziggurat of Uruk, the Eanna temple, was dedicated to Inanna, the goddess of love and war, but she was also the keeper of the Me. The texts describe how Inanna traveled to Eridu to trick Enki, the god of wisdom, into giving her the sets of decrees that govern civilization. In a grounded context, this represents the transfer of the first civilization's technical data from its ancient center in the south to the rising power of the north. This transfer was not a magical event, but a strategic effort to consolidate the remaining pre-flood knowledge in a single, secure location. Uruk became the hub of this legacy, the city where the first writing appeared not as poetry, but as a system of accounting to manage the complex resources of the state. The invention of writing was a response to the loss of the long-lived king's memory. When a ruler only lives for 100 years, his knowledge must be externalized if the civilization is to survive. The King List provides a name that bridges the gap between the mythological and the historical: Gilgamesh. Listed as the fifth king of the first dynasty of Uruk, Gilgamesh is said to have ruled for 126 years. This duration is within the realm of biological possibility, yet his story is defined by a desperate, failed quest for immortality. This quest is the central trauma of the post-flood world. Gilgamesh, possessing the genetic heritage of the first civilization, lived longer than his subjects but still faced the inevitability of death. His journey to find Utnapishtim, the survivor of the flood, was an attempt to recover the anomalous engineering that had granted the antediluvian kings their 30,000-year reigns. He failed, and his failure represents the final acceptance of the short-lived condition of modern humanity. The King List records his name and his 126-year reign as a marker of this transition, the point where the giants finally became men. The stratigraphic layers above the Kish and Uruk deposits are increasingly dominated by the evidence of conflict and resource depletion. As the lifespans of the rulers shortened, the pace of society accelerated. The long-term management of the first civilization was replaced by the short-term competition of the city-states. The King List tracks this shift, recording the frequent transfers of kingship from one city to another: Ur, Adab, Mari, Akshak. The stability of the 241,000-year pre-flood era was gone, replaced by a cycle of rise and fall that mirrors our own modern history. The Sumerians looked back on the first kingship as a golden age of peace and order, a time when the world was managed by those who could see across the millennia. The chemistry of the artifacts found in the later levels of Ur and Lagash shows a decline in the purity and complexity of metallurgical alloys. The wall of the metalworkers had become a memory, and the secrets of high-energy processing were lost. The Sumerians were now working with copper and tin, a far cry from the refined materials that would have been required to sustain the infrastructure of a 30,000-year reign. This technical regression is a common feature of post-catastrophic societies, where the most advanced knowledge is the first to be lost because it requires the most complex social and industrial support systems. The King List is the catalog of this loss, a ledger of the diminishing returns of a civilization that was slowly losing its grip on its own heritage. The site of Ur, with its magnificent royal cemetery and its iconic ziggurat, represents the pinnacle of the post-flood Sumerian achievement. The excavations by Leonard Woolley in the 1920s revealed a world of stunning craftsmanship and complex social hierarchy. But even here, in the tombs of Pwabi and Mescalamdug, the weight of the short time is palpable. The kings of Ur were wealthy and powerful, but their reigns were measured in decades, not millennia. They were the masters of a fragmented world, built on the silty remains of a much greater past. The King List acknowledges the first and second dynasties of Ur, but the numbers are now standard. The anomaly has been smoothed out by the passage of time and the degradation of the biological and technological foundations of the first civilization. The investigation of the Sumerian King List is a journey into the deepest recesses of the human story. It forces us to confront the possibility that we are not the protagonists of history, but the late-arriving scavengers of a world that was once much grander and more stable than our own. The 241,200 years of the pre-flood kings are a chronological challenge that we cannot ignore. They are etched in the clay of the Weld-Blundell Prism, a physical record that has survived the rise and fall of empires, the shifts of the rivers, and the scouring of the desert winds. This prism is a bridge to the forgotten Earth, a world where time was measured in geological substages and the rule of law was as constant as the movements of the planets. As we stand in the modern trenches of southern Iraq, the smell of dry earth and the silence of the desert provide a tactile connection to this lost history. Every shovelful of dirt is a movement through time, a descent into the stratigraphic layers that hold the secrets of the antediluvian world. We may never find the wall of the metalworkers or the high-density masonry of the first Eridu, but we have the King List. It is our map and our anchor, a document that tells us that the first civilization was real, that it lasted for an immense duration, and that its legacy is still with us, buried in the soil and the collective memory of our species. That the Sumerians so highly prized were perhaps not just datasets, but physical artifacts, biological regulators or environmental stabilizers that allowed the first kings to maintain their extreme longevity. When these devices failed or were lost during the flood, the kingship was fundamentally diminished. The post-flood history is a record of the struggle to function without these tools, to maintain order in a world where the primary mechanisms of control had been scrubbed away. The King List is the administrative record of this struggle, a testimony to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of absolute loss. It is a document that honors the memory of the giants while recording the rise of the men who would eventually replace them. The transition from the late Pleistocene to the Holocene was marked by a series of climate shocks that would have been devastating to any civilization. The Younger Dryas, a period of sudden, extreme cooling that lasted for 1,200 years, would have shattered the agricultural and industrial systems of the pre-flood world. This was followed by a rapid warming and a massive rise in sea levels, the flood. The King List captures the chronological footprint of this transition, showing the collapse of the 241,000-year stability and the onset of the chaotic, short-lived world we recognize today. The precision of the dates in the list, even the seemingly impossible ones, suggests a high level of chronological awareness, a determination to track the exact timing of the catastrophe and its aftermath. The silence of the desert at night is a reflection of the silence that has swallowed the first civilization. But for those who know how to read the layers of the earth and the wedges of the cuneiform, that silence is full of information. It tells us of the rise and fall of Eridu, the metallurgical mastery of Bad Tibra, and the astronomical wisdom of Sapar. It tells us of the 241,200 years of the pre-flood rule, a period of human history that is longer and more significant than everything that has come since. The Sumerian King List is our only window into this vast, forgotten era, a record that forces us to look beyond the limits of our own experience and to see the true scale of the forgotten earth. The weight of the sediment above the ruins of Shuruppak is nearly 5 meters in some places. This is the weight of 5,000 years of history, pressing down on the evidence of the sweep of the flood. To reach the pre-flood levels, an archaeologist must dig through the remains of the Akkadians, the Neo-Sumerians, the Kassites, and the Babylonians. Each layer is a chapter in the short-lived history of our species. But at the bottom of the trench, beneath the sterile yellow clay, lies the story of the long-lived masters. This is the true frontier of archaeology, the search for the foundations of the first civilization. The King List is the document that tells us the search is worth it, that there is something to be found, and that the history we have been taught is only the final, briefest chapter of a much longer story. The atmospheric details of the Mesopotamian basin, the shimmering heat haze, the bitter cold of the desert nights, the saline crust that forms on every exposed surface, are the same forces that have been working to erase the record of the ancient kings for millennia. Yet the clay persists. The Weld-Blundell Prism, with its 4 columns of text, stands as a defiance of these natural processes. It is a man-made object that has outlasted the cities it records, a survivor of the short time that carries the message of the long time. When we study its inscriptions, we are engaging in a form of chronological rescue, bringing the names of the first kings back into the light of the modern day. Alulim, Alanger, Enmenluana, these are not just sounds, but the names of individuals who saw the world when it was young and who ruled it for tens of thousands of years. The investigation of the Sumerian King List is not a pursuit of fantasy, but a rigorous analysis of the available historical and geological data. It requires us to accept the possibility that the standard narrative of human development is incomplete, and that a primary, advanced civilization existed long before the first mud bricks of Uruk were laid. This civilization was not alien or magical. It was a natural development of the human or a precursor species in a different environmental epoch. Its mastery of anomalous engineering was the result of hundreds of thousands of years of stable progress, a level of achievement that we are only now beginning to approach. The King List is our evidence of this achievement, an administrative ledger that tracks the 241,200 years of its greatest era. The sun sets over the ruins of Kish, the shadows of the ziggurats stretching out like the fingers of a giant. These structures were the last attempt of the post-flood survivors to reach the heights of their ancestors, to create a physical link between the earth and the heavens. They were built on a foundation of memory and loss, a desperate effort to maintain the kingship in a world that was rapidly forgetting its own origins. The King List is the textual equivalent of the ziggurat, a monumental structure of data that reaches back into the deep time of the Pleistocene. It is a testament to the power of the human intellect to record its own history, even when that history defies the limits of biological possibility. The story of the Sumerian King List is the story of the forgotten earth, a world of immense duration and sophisticated governance that was erased by the forces of nature. We are the inheritors of this world, living in the ruins of a 241,000-year-old civilization. The King List is our guide to our own past, a record that challenges us to look deeper, to think bigger, and to remember the kings who ruled as long as the stars. As we continue to excavate the mounds of Mesopotamia and to analyze the sediments of the Persian Gulf, we will find more evidence of this first stage. But for now, we have the prism, a four-sided block of baked clay that holds the weight of 250,000 years of history in the palm of a hand. The biological stabilization that allowed for such long lives would have had profound implications for the social structure of the pre-flood cities. There would be no need for the rapid, often violent, succession of rulers that characterizes the post-flood dynasties. A single king could oversee the development of his city for 30 millennia, ensuring a continuity of vision and a stability of law that is impossible in our current world. The technical and legal protocols of the state, would be refined and perfected over the course of geological epochs. This was a civilization of profound patience and long-term planning, a society that viewed the earth not as a resource to be exploited, but as a system to be managed. The King List is the administrative record of this management, a catalog of the individuals who held the responsibility for the planet's equilibrium for 241,200 years. The transition to the short-lived state was not just a biological change, but a psychological one. The post-flood survivors lived with the constant, gnawing awareness of their own mortality, a concept that would have been alien to their ancestors. This awareness drove them to build monuments, to conquer their neighbors, and to record their names in stone, all in a desperate attempt to achieve some form of symbolic immortality. The quest of Gilgamesh is the defining expression of this new human condition. The King List, by recording the durations of the pre-flood reigns, serves as a painful reminder of what was lost, a world where immortality was not a quest, but a biological reality. As the grit of the desert continues to settle on the ruins of the ancient cities, the stratigraphic record grows thicker, burying the secrets of the past even deeper. But the King List remains a constant, a signal from the deep time of the Pleistocene that continues to resonate in the modern day. It tells us that our history is much longer than we have been told, that our potential is much greater than we currently realize, and that we are the children of a civilization that once ruled the earth for 250,000 years. The Weld-Blundell prism is the key to this forgotten heritage, a physical object that forces us to reckon with the true scale of our existence on this planet. The scent of the dry earth at Shuruppak, the site of the last pre-flood kingship, is a reminder of the fragility of our world. One day, the sweep of the flood will come again, in whatever form it takes, and our own cities will be buried under layers of silt and sand. What will we leave behind? Will we have the foresight to record our history as meticulously as the Sumerians did? Will we leave behind a document that challenges the survivors of the future to remember who we were and what we achieved? The King List is a model of such a record, a defiant act of memory that has survived for 4 millennia to tell us the story of the giants who lived before the flood. The investigation of the Sumerian King List is a slow burn because it requires us to move beyond the superficiality of modern history and to engage with the deep cycles of the earth. It forces us to look at the stratigraphic layers not just as dirt and rock, but as a record of the rise and fall of civilizations over the course of hundreds of thousands of years. The 241,200 years of the pre-flood kings are the most significant part of that record, a period of human achievement that dwarfs everything that has come since. The King List is our bridge to that world, a sequence of names and numbers that stretch back into the darkness of the past, reminding us that we are not the first, and we will not be the last, to call this forgotten earth our home. Continuing to explore the specifics of the pre-flood cities, we move to the city of Larak. The name itself is thought to mean seeing the glow, a reference perhaps to the city's role as a center for astronomical or high-energy observation. Its king, Ensephezadana, ruled for 28,800 years. In a society of such immense duration, the physical layout of a city like Larak would be a masterpiece of anomalous engineering. The foundations would be built to withstand the slow, grinding movement of the tectonic plates, and the buildings would be designed to capture and utilize the energy of the environment. The glow of Larak was likely not mystical, but the literal light of a civilization that had mastered the management of energy on a planetary scale. The King List records the transfer of kingship to Sippar after Larak. Sippar was the city of the sun, and its king, Enmendarana, ruled for 21,000 years. Sippar was known as a center of justice and law, but in the context of the pre-flood world, law meant the fundamental rules of the physical world: mathematics, geometry, and physics. The tablets of destiny were kept here, and they were likely the primary data storage units of the civilization, containing the essential constants required to maintain the technological infrastructure. A ruler like Enmendarana would have been the ultimate curator of this knowledge, a guardian of the source code of the first civilization. The final pre-flood city, Shuruppak, was ruled by Ubirtutu for 18,600 years. Shuruppak was the city of the hero of the flood, Ziusadra, who is the Sumerian original of the biblical Noah. The King List does not mention Ziusadra by name as a king, but it records his father, Ubirtutu, as the last of the antediluvian line. This implies that the kingship was in the process of being handed down when the catastrophe struck. The flood that swept over interrupted the sequence, bringing a violent end to the 241,200-year history. The city of Shuruppak, now the site of Tel Farah, holds the physical record of this interruption in its famous sterile layer of silt. The grit of the sand under the archaeologist's fingernails is a tactile link to the day the flood arrived. The transition from the organic-rich layers of the pre-flood settlement to the sterile clay of the flood deposit is sharp and unambiguous. It is a moment in time captured in the soil. For the people of Shuruppak, it was the end of a world that had been stable for 20,000 years under the rule of a single family. The terror of that day is lost to history, but the physical evidence remains: a layer of cold, damp clay that serves as the tombstone for the first civilization. The kings of the first dynasty of Kish were the pioneers of the post-flood world. They were the ones who had to navigate the transition from the long-lived to the short-lived state. Their reigns, while still hundreds of years long, show a rapid biological decay. Jushur, the first king, was followed by Kolasinabel, who ruled for 960 years. The name Kolasinabel means all of them were lord, a cryptic reference perhaps to a period of collective rule or social fragmentation after the collapse of the central pre-flood authority. The stability of the old world was gone, and the new rulers were struggling to maintain the kingship in a world that was becoming increasingly chaotic and resource-poor. The site of Kish is a testament to this struggle. The ziggurats and palaces were built with a scale and a precision that attempted to evoke the grandeur of the old world, but the materials were different. The high-density, vitrified masonry of the antediluvians was replaced by mud brick and bitumen. The anomalous engineering was gone, replaced by a labor-intensive, resource-depleting technology that characterizes all the civilizations that have followed. The King List is the catalog of this decline, a record of the diminishing returns of a species that was losing its grip on its own primary knowledge. The transition from the Kish dynasty to the first dynasty of Uruk marks the arrival of the modern human condition. The reigns of the kings of Uruk, such as Meskhangashur, Enmerkar, and Lugalbanda, are measured in hundreds of years, but by the time we reach Gilgamesh, the duration is only 126 years. This is the point where the long-lived heritage finally disappears, and the short-lived reality of the Holocene takes over. The King List records this transition with a precision that suggests it was a matter of intense administrative concern. The loss of longevity was the loss of the primary mechanism of stability, and the Sumerians were desperate to track its progress. The site of Uruk, with its massive city walls and its complex temple precincts, was the first true metropolis of the post-flood world. But even here, the shadow of the giants loomed large. The Eanna Temple, the House of Heaven, was built on the foundations of a much older structure, an attempt to reconnect with the orbital origins of the kingship. The kings of Uruk were the keepers of the remaining me, the datasets that allowed them to manage a city of tens of thousands of people. But they were no longer the masters of the planet. They were merely the rulers of a single city-state, competing with their neighbors for land and water. The global unity of the pre-flood world was a memory, recorded only in the names and numbers of the King List. The investigation of the King List leads us to the site of Ur, the city of the moon god, Nana. The ziggurat of Ur is the most well-preserved of all the Mesopotamian ziggurats, its massive, layered form rising out of the desert like a monument to a forgotten age. The King List records 2 dynasties of Ur, but the reigns of the kings are now standard human durations. The long-lived anomaly has been smoothed out, and the history of Ur is the history of a Bronze Age power, not a Pleistocene giant. Yet the very existence of the ziggurat, with its focus on the movements of the moon and the stars, shows that the deep-time heritage of the Sumerians was still alive in their religious and scientific practices. The texture of the sun-bleached stone at Ur is a reminder of the thousands of years of exposure to the harsh desert environment. Every crack and every weathered surface is a mark of the passage of time. The Sumerians built their ziggurats to last, but even stone and brick eventually succumb to the slow, grinding forces of erosion. The only thing that truly lasts is information, baked into clay and preserved in the archives of the temples. The King List is the most important piece of that information, a record of a 241,200-year history that would have been lost if it had not been meticulously transcribed and protected by generations of scribes. The weight of the forgotten earth is the weight of the millions of individuals who lived and died during the pre-flood era, and whose stories have been erased by the sweep of the flood. We only have the names of the kings, the 8 individuals who stood at the top of the social hierarchy for 250,000 years. What was life like for the common people of the pre-flood world? Did they also live for thousands of years, or was longevity a privilege of the elite, maintained through anomalous engineering? The King List does not tell us, but it hints at a society of profound stability and specialized labor, where the shepherds and the metalworkers were the foundational pillars of the state. The investigation of the Sumerian King List is a slow burn, because it forces us to sit with the silence of the past and to listen to the echoes of a world that is no longer there. It requires us to look at the clay tablets and the stratigraphic layers not as artifacts, but as evidence of a biological and technological reality that defies our current understanding. The 241,200 years of the pre-flood kings are a chronological challenge that we must meet if we are to understand the true nature of our history. They are the record of a world where time was different, and the kings lived as long as the stars. The scent of the bitumen at the site of Eridu is a link to the first city of the antediluvian kings. Eridu was the place where the kingship lowered from heaven, and where the first king, Alulum, ruled for 28,800 years. The ruins of Eridu are among the oldest in the world, a series of temples built one on top of the other, reaching back into the Ubaid period. But the first Eridu, the city of the Pleistocene, lies deep beneath the water table, buried in the mud of the ancient Persian Gulf Plain. We may never reach it, but the King List tells us it was there, and that it was the center of a civilization that lasted for geological epochs. The grit of the desert wind at Eridu is the same grit that filled the halls of the palaces 30,000 years ago. The environment has changed, the rivers have shifted, and the kings are gone. But the physical reality of the Mesopotamian basin remains the same. The King List is our only guide to this landscape of deep time, a record that tethers our short, flickering lives to the immense duration of the forgotten earth. It tells us that we are the heirs to a 241,200-year history, and that the names of the first kings are the names of our own ancestors, the masters of the world before the flood swept over. As the sun rises over the mounds of Abu Sharain, the light illuminates the textures of the earth, revealing the stratigraphic layers that hold the secrets of the past. The King List is the framework that allows us to interpret these layers, to see the history of the earth not as a series of random events, but as a structured, intentional process. The pre-flood kings were the guardians of that process, the individuals who maintained the stability of the human species for 250,000 years. Their names and their durations are recorded in the Weld-Blundell prism, a physical object that forces us to reckon with the true scale of our history on this forgotten earth. The biological reality of the 30,000-year reigns requires us to consider a form of cellular repair that is far beyond our current capabilities. This anomalous engineering would have involved the active management of the DNA, preventing the accumulation of the mutations and the epigenetic changes that cause aging. Such a technology would require a sophisticated understanding of the molecular basis of life, a level of knowledge that implies a civilization of immense technical capability. The Sumerians spoke of the me that governed biological life, and the King List is the administrative record of the individuals who were the beneficiaries of this knowledge. The transition to the short-lived state after the flood was a biological catastrophe of global proportions. The survivors were forced to adapt to a world where their lifespans were reduced by 99%. This would have led to a sudden loss of institutional memory and a rapid degradation of the technical and social infrastructure of the civilization. The post-flood history is a record of the struggle to maintain order in the face of this biological collapse. The King List tracks this struggle, recording the shortening of the reigns and the frequent shifts of the kingship from city to city as the old world slowly faded away. The silence of the desert at night is a reflection of the silence that has swallowed the names of the common people of the pre-flood world. But the names of the kings remain, etched in the clay of the Weld-Blundell prism.
Alulim, Alalegar, Enmen Luana, Enmen Galana, Dumusid, Ensi Patsidana, Enmen Durana, Ubara Tutu.
These 8 names are the only thing that remains of a 241,200-year history. They are the bridge to the forgotten earth, a world of immense duration and sophisticated governance that was erased by the sweep of the flood. The King List is their testament, a record that tells us that once, the kingship lasted as long as the stars, and the world was ruled by those who lived through the deep time of the earth. The chemical and isotopic analysis of the lowest occupational levels at Eridu reveals a signature that is increasingly difficult to categorize within the standard Neolithic framework. In the deepest soundings, beneath the already ancient Abade pottery, the soil contains high concentrations of microscopic, spheroidal silicates, particles that have been subjected to temperatures so intense they have vitrified into a glass-like state. This is not the byproduct of a domestic hearth or a pottery kiln. It is the residue of high-energy processes, perhaps related to the energy production required to sustain a city for 30 millennia. If the kingship that lowered from heaven brought with it a mastery of the physical world, it would have left these silent, microscopic markers in the very earth that eventually swallowed it. The stratigraphic record does not just show a change in tool types. It shows a change in the fundamental interaction between humanity and the physical laws of the planet. As we examine the transition from the antediluvian era to the post-flood world, the decline in longevity recorded in the King List takes on a profound biological weight. The decay curve is not merely a numerical curiosum but a documentation of a species under extreme environmental pressure. The post-flood world was characterized by a less stable magnetic field, allowing a greater flux of ionizing radiation to reach the surface. This radiation, striking the DNA of the survivors, would have accelerated the accumulation of somatic mutations, leading to the rapid onset of senescence that the Sumerians recorded with such administrative precision. The first kings were the products of a stable, protected Pleistocene environment, their biology optimized for a duration we can scarcely comprehend. The post-flood humans were the short-lived, their existence compressed into a frantic, century-long struggle for survival. The King List is the ledger of this biological tragedy, tracking the loss of the genetic inheritance that had once allowed individuals to rule for 30,000 years. The me, those enigmatic sets of decrees and physical objects that formed the basis of Sumerian civilization, were likely the surviving technical manuals and hardware of the pre-flood world. In the texts, the me are physical items that can be handled, stolen, and transported. They represent the standardized protocols for everything from hydraulic engineering to the administration of law. When Inanna brought the me to Uruk, she was not bringing abstract ideas, but the physical tools required to restart a complex society in the ruins of the old one. The ziggurats themselves were likely designed as shielded repositories for these artifacts, their massive mud brick layers providing protection against the environmental stressors that were shortening the lives of the people. To stand at the base of the ziggurat of Ur is to stand before a massive, artificial mountain designed to preserve the last remnants of a 241,000-year-old legacy. The construction of the Weld-Blundell prism itself was an act of profound historical preservation. The scribe, working in the city of Larsa around 1800 BCE, was not merely copying a list of names. He was engaged in a form of chronological rescue. He was taking the fragile oral traditions and the crumbling tablets of the earlier eras and baking them into a durable four-sided prism of clay. He would have felt the weight of the information he was recording, the names of kings who had ruled before the world was broken by the water. The rhythmic striking of his stylus against the wet clay was a heartbeat across time, a defiance of the oblivion that had already claimed so much of the first civilization. When the prism was placed in the kiln, the heat transformed the soft sediment of the river into a stone-like record, a physical object capable of carrying the names of Alulim and Alangar through the next 4,000 years of desert dust and conflict. This chronological continuity is not isolated to Mesopotamia. If we look toward the Nile Valley, the Egyptian historian Manetho recorded a similar reign of the gods that lasted for 30,000 years, followed by a reign of the demigods. In the Indus Valley, the Puranic chronologies of India speak of the yugas, vast cycles of time lasting hundreds of thousands of years. These global records suggest that the Sumerian King List is part of a universal tradition, a collective human memory of a first age that was global in scope and immense in duration. The 241,200 years of the Sumerian antediluvians are the most mathematically precise of these records, providing a specific anchor for the study of this lost epoch. The Forgotten Earth was not a collection of isolated cultures, but a unified global system governed by a long-lived elite who managed the planet's systems with a perspective that spanned geological substages. The transition from the long time to the short time brought with it a shift in the human psyche. In the pre-flood world, the permanence of the kings and the stability of the cities provided a sense of eternal order. There was no need for the monuments to individual ego that characterize our modern history. But in the post-flood world, the awareness of death drove the survivors to build bigger, to conquer faster, and to record their names with an almost desperate urgency. The ziggurats, the epic poems, and the royal tombs are all expressions of this new, finite existence. The King List, by contrast, feels cold and detached, a remnant of the old way of thinking where time was not a scarce resource but a vast, manageable expanse. It is a document of the long time, surviving in a world of short time. The silence that now covers the mounds of Shuruppak and Bad Tibra is the same silence that must have followed the sweep of the flood. It is the silence of a world that has been scrubbed clean. But for the investigator, this silence is full of information. It is found in the thickness of the silt, the chemical composition of the vitrified silicates, and the precision of the cuneiform wedges. Every detail points toward a history that is far older and more complex than the one we have been taught. The Sumerians were not the beginning. They were the end of something much larger. They were the curators of a dying world, clutching at the names of the kings who had ruled when the earth was young and the stars were constant. The texture of the clay on the Weld-Blundell prism is smooth and cool to the touch, its surface is worn by the passage of millennia. It is a fragile thing, yet it has outlasted every empire that has risen since it was fired. It is a physical manifestation of the Sumerian obsession with the preservation of the record. They knew that the sweep of the flood could come again, and they wanted to ensure that the 241,200-year history of the first civilization would not be lost. They were successful. The prism remains, a challenge to our understanding of human potential and a map to the deepest layers of our past. It tells us that we are the children of the giants, living in the ruins of a world that once belonged to those who lived as long as the mountains. As the sun sets over the Euphrates, the water reflects the orange and red hues of a sky that has seen the rise and fall of countless generations. The river continues to carry its load of silt, slowly burying the remains of the ancient cities under new layers of earth. The stratigraphic record grows, but the King List remains a constant, a signal from the deep time of the Pleistocene that continues to vibrate in the modern world. It is the story of the forgotten Earth, a world of immense duration and sophisticated governance that was erased by the forces of nature. We are the heirs to this history, and the names of the first kings, Alulim, Alalnger, Enmenluana, are the echoes of our own potential, a reminder of what humanity once was and what it might one day become again. The final realization of the investigation is that the Sumerian King List is not a myth, but a forensic document. It is the administrative record of a civilization that mastered the biological and environmental variables of its era. The 241,200 years of the pre-flood kings are a documented fact of their historical tradition, supported by the physical evidence of the flood layer and the anomalous technical signatures found in the deepest levels of the tells. To dismiss this record is to dismiss the only evidence we have of our true history. We must have the courage to believe the clay, to accept the numbers, and to recognize that we are merely a brief chapter in the immense story of the earth. The kings of Eridu were real, and their 241,000-year rule is the foundation upon which our own world is built. The desert air at night is a cold, abrasive presence, a reminder of the harsh reality of the post-flood environment. But as we look up at the stars, we see the same constellations that the first kings observed for tens of thousands of years. The stars are the only thing that has not changed. They are the silent witnesses to the 241,200 years of the first kingship and to the catastrophe that ended it. The King List is our attempt to bridge the gap between the stars and the earth, to connect our short lives to the deep time of the universe. It is the final, enduring message of the Sumerians, a record of the forgotten earth that will remain as long as there is someone to read the wedges and to wonder at the numbers. The investigation ends where it began, in the dust of the southern Mesopotamian plain. The mounds hold their secrets, the silt covers the foundations, and the wind continues its tireless work of erosion. But the names are preserved. The durations are recorded. The 241,200 years of the Forbidden Rule are no longer a mystery, but a historical reality that we are only now beginning to understand. We are the survivors of the flood, living in the short time, but we carry within us the memory of the long time, the age of the kings who lived as long as the stars and ruled the world before the water swept it all away.